Hello, welcome to Venture Capital with me, Katie Pilbeam. This week, ECB Chief Mario Draghi entered what he described just 2 years ago as uncharted waters. Plus, the G7 countries met and threatened harder-hitting sanctions against Russia. I asked a Russian oligarch for his reaction. Plus, France is trying to convince the US that a $10 billion fine against a French banking giant is unreasonable. And Tim Kirby, he'll be up a little later on. But in the meantime, let's talk about the G7, because the nations, well, they met this week, and the proposal for the harder-hitting sanctions against Russia were indeed a threat. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said Western powers would check again and again to verify that Russia was doing what it could to stabilise the situation in Crimea. She referred to restrictions on trade, finance and energy. Now, our correspondent Paul Scott was in Brussels and watched the talks.
So, the G7 concludes here in Brussels, the two-day talking shop trying to find solutions to some of the world's most complex issues, including the environment, the Ukraine crisis and, of course, the global economy. All without the voice and the opinion of Russia, who, of course, have been sidelined from the summit. Now, it was Ukraine that really dominated proceedings. German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying in the build-up to the summit that Germany wouldn't hesitate to slap further sanctions on Russia if the situation in eastern Ukraine deteriorated. And that was a sentiment that was echoed by the G7, the 7 leading industrial nations. They say, and I quote, that they are ready to intensify targeted sanctions should events so require. But now the talking has stopped, and with signs that the humanitarian crisis in the east of Ukraine is getting worse, only time will tell whether the G7 are true to their word and if they're really ready to ramp up sanctions on Russia.
And talking of sanctions, this week I caught up with the head of Russian steel giant Severstal and billionaire Alexei Mordashov. Now, Mr. Mordashov has been operating in the US for over 10 years. So I asked if he is at all concerned about these ongoing threats.
We don't see any specific impact of sanctions, neither on Severstal nor on the Russian economy as a whole, short term at least. Probably there is long-term potential threat, a risk of deterioration of trust. Of course, this not sanctions specifically, but tension and political rhetoric have an implied risk to undermine trust, which could be long-term detrimental for all of us, for the Western countries, for Russia. And we hope that politicians, all nations, will find the way to avoid it, because in general it's very detrimental for economies. Hopefully our Ukrainian colleagues will find the way after last election to manage country, to navigate country in the right way of social peace, coherence, and which will be helpful, hopefully, to reduce tension.
The territory of negative interest rates for banks has now been entered by the ECB. The new deposit rate is aimed at boosting lending, and the idea is that banks will be more inclined to do so to avoid paying to keep money at the central bank. Now, the decision was made to avoid the ongoing threat of deflation, which halts economic growth because consumers stop spending and investors stop investing. Now, also this week, the US is trying to enforce a record $10 billion fine against BNP Paribas. Now, French President François Hollande said he would speak with the US president during the G7 talks about the investigation because, as he says, it has an impact on the French economy and the European economy. But Barack Obama said he will not be getting involved because it is a US tradition that the president does not meddle in prosecutions. Now, the fine will be imposed if allegations of alleged trade sanction violations are proved. Now, I'm going to discuss that drama as well as the ECB meeting now with Angus Campbell from FX Pro. A negative interest rate, is this a wise move?
Well, it's a move that really has been forced upon the European Central Bank because the Eurozone is suffering from a bout of low inflation, which is a real concern for them because this condition is not good where you're trying to stimulate economies, in particular those peripheral economies that seem to have improved somewhat, but are still suffering from very, very low economic growth. So what the ECB is trying to do is trying to, in effect, charge banks for depositing money with the European Central Bank, so that they will not do that, but instead take on the risk of lending money to the wider economy. That should hopefully then boost the economy and in turn increase inflation for the Eurozone as well.
And when we talk about deflation, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because you always think that it's a better option to say inflation. But as we know, it plagued the Japanese economy for some 2 decades, didn't it? Can you see some parallels between what happened in Japan and, say, what's happening in the Eurozone now, for instance? How much of a problem could it be?
Well, it could be a significant problem because what you need to see, you've effectively got a 2-tier Europe. Of course, the Eurozone is very different to Japan. Japan is one economy, one country. In the Eurozone, you're dealing with many different economies and many different countries. You have a peripheral Eurozone, which is relatively much poorer than, say, the core Eurozone, France and Germany. And the disconnect between the two is causing significant issues. But so in the long term, the periphery has to become more competitive and in a way suffer deflation to some degree in order to bring the pricing back down to more normal levels, whereas the overall Eurozone probably won't necessarily suffer from deflation.
I just want to ask and move on now to do with BNP Paribas. What is the situation here? Because do you think that we could have some bankers lose their jobs over this situation? And with that as well, is it Francois Hollande's right to get involved and ask the US not to have this massive $10 billion imposed on the bank?
Well, I suppose that Francois Hollande's, his action just goes to show how serious and how big a fine this potentially could be for BNP Paribas. And most certainly there is likely to be some executive heads roll on the back of it. To put things in perspective, what you have to understand is that really the Department of Justice in the US is not very happy with the way BNP has been cooperating with them. They started investigations as long ago as 2007, and apparently it wasn't until a few years later that really they started to cooperate. And the thing that really has upset the Justice Department is the fact that apparently there were still transactions being made with these sanctioned countries even when the probe had long started. So it's been going on for a long time now, a number of years, and maybe through fault of BNP, perhaps they had, really have not been cooperating properly enough, and therefore, as a result, you do have to look at the executives and the key management. Of course, the Department of Justice in the US is calling for a few heads to roll, and as part of any settlement, they do want to see a shake-up there. 10 billion is a very large sum. It would wipe out their earnings for this year alone, and it would affect their operations quite significantly. But I'm sure that regardless of what Francois Hollande and President Obama may have spoken about, because it is completely separate to any sort of political influence, I am sure that there will be some settlement, and the BNP Paribas is unlikely to have to pay that sum of money in the end.
OK, Angus Campbell, thank you so much joining us today from FX Pro. I really appreciate your time there. Have a good day. And more news from Europe. Lithuania will follow in the footsteps of its fellow Baltic nations and adopt the euro. The green light to join the euro area has been given after its bid to join was turned down 8 years ago. The country could adopt the single currency on January the 1st, 2015. Let's move on to some corporate news then, shall we? The metals magnate Alexei Mordashov said that 2/3 of the world's metals companies are operating at a loss. he predicts that the global industry will remain in a state of crisis until 2018, pointing to price fluctuations and a slowdown in the Chinese economy. Russia's leading car manufacturer will lay off up to 8,500 of its employees. Avtovaz will make the cuts due to falling car sales. But current production volumes will remain the same for now. Russia's car market is expected to shrink by 20% this year. Russia's biggest search engine, Yandex, is planning to transform its online shopping search site, Yandex.Market, allowing customers to buy direct. The company wants to capitalise on the growing e-commerce market. Russia's e-commerce sector is worth around $17 billion. Also this week, Yandex was listed on the Moscow Stock Exchange, in addition to New York's. OK, let's get over to the business desk. We're going to join the maverick that is Tim Kirby. Hello to you, sir. Now, how are you getting on this week? You went for Eurocali, didn't you?
Actually, no. This week, I believe it was United Aircraft Corporation.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I'm not keeping up with you.
Don't worry about it, because in all honesty, a lot of people in Russia forget that there is an aviation and auto industry in the country. But unfortunately, their stocks reflected the conditions of the auto and aviation industry in Russia, and things were pretty stagnant and lost a little bit of ground. So I think I lost like $44, but when you're such a high roller like me, that is a trivial amount of money.
Yeah.
Let's see what we're going to invest in this week.
It's just a dip, not a nosedive.
Nah, just a little bit of money. And is it going to be your choice? It's Katie's choice.
Okay.
So we have all sorts of companies. We have the Yandex, the Russian Google, Alrosa, Diamonds, Gazprom, Norilsk Nickel, Rosneft, Kiwi, which is a payment system, Megaphone, the provider.
Have we ever done Metro before? Have we ever done it?
No.
I don't think we have. I think we should go into, you know, uncharted territory, as we were saying earlier.
All right, sounds good. Well, Metro is a gigantic mining operation, and if there's one thing Russia's good at, it is exporting those raw resources. So let's hope that we make some money on Metro. Thank you very much, Katie, for being merciful.
And Tim, listen, it's not over yet, because we've got to sort out your style. You're not very smart, and it's my choice. So I think next week you're going to bet on Metro, and you're also going to do it in a bow tie.
In a bow tie?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
All right.
So good luck.
Yes, ma'am.
And we're going to go for Metro, and it's my choice, so.
Fine.
See you next week in your bow tie. Right, Tim in a bow tie next week. We need to jazz him up. He needs a bit of style, doesn't he? Now, talking of style, I'll be here next week. Same studio, same place, but different dress. See you then.